Karin, first word to you, or can I start just presenting Jeremy?
Yes, you can start with the introduction. I can just say that you are all very welcome to this
yes.
of the seminar series of the project Arms, Beats and Clothes, African Consumers and the 19th Century Global Economy. The abbreviation is ABC. We are very happy to have Jeremy here today, not only because we are looking forward to listening to your presentation on clothing empires, Indian Ocean Africa, Japanese cotton textiles, and colonial capitalism. Thank you for putting the title just there. But also, as Giacomo said, because your work has been very inspirational for us and for our project. I think that in the first 2 pages we mentioned your work like 5 times, and this has been also very effective because the project received funding. So we are happy and grateful to have you here today. So given that Massimo is the coordinator of the cloth research unit of the project, he will,
Yeah, I will introduce you.
Yeah.
I mean, maybe it's not so important, but anyway, I will just provide a few information about Jeremy. Jeremy Prestholdt is a professor of history at the University of California, San Diego. And he works on African, Indian Ocean, and the global history with an emphasis on consumer culture and politics in the 19th and 20th century East Africa. And his articles have appeared in journals such as American Historical Review, the Journal of African History, the Journal of Global History, the Journal of World History, and finally the Journal of Eastern African Studies. Jeremy has also contributed to many edited volumes. Is the author of 2 important books. The first one is Domesticating the World, African Consumerism and the Genealogies of Globalization, published by the University of California Press, 2008. And the second book is Icons of Dissent, the Global Resonance of Che, Marley, Tupac, and Bin Laden, published by Oxford University Press in 2019. Going back to Domesticating the World, here Prestholdt explore how a consumer desire in East Africa influenced production and trade in the United States, Britain, India, and elsewhere. And using a broad range of sources is examine how East African consumers experience and used imported goods and the place of Africa in the historical and contemporary world. In his second book, Icon of Dissent, Prestholdt moves from economic history and the history of consumerism to the study of transnational imagination and sentiments, exploring the meanings attributed to the 4 iconic figures of Che Guevara, Bob Marley, Tupac Shakur, and Osama bin Laden in different countries and places. Prestholdt is the co-editor of Monsoon, Journal of Indian Ocean Rim, that is a new journal published by Duke University Press, and he started collaborating with the African Institute, the institute that is publishing this journal in 2023, and is also co-editor of the Brill monograph series African Social Studies. And I think I stop here and I leave the floor to Jeremy. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks very much. I really appreciate the opportunity to speak in this series. The project is fantastic. Of course, it's a topic, as you've already noted, very near and dear to my heart. Something that, as you will see, I have returned to, questions I should say, that I've returned to in a slightly different manner, but in many ways, questions about Africa's global engagements, questions about African consumer cultures in the Western Indian Ocean, Eastern Africa, but as opposed to Domesticating the World, which looked at those questions, as you said, in the late 19th century in particular. The project that I'll talk about today moves a little bit forward into the 20th century looking at not only some of the same questions, but how they're complicated, shaped by the circumstances of the early colonial period. And specifically what I want to talk about today, just part of a larger project, is the interwar period. But before I get into those details, let me say that in a broad sense, what I want to talk about today is the nexus of East African consumer cultures, capitalism, empire, and then ultimately colonial policy. More precisely, by reflecting on East African demand for Japanese textiles and apparel, what I'll do is I'll sketch out the relationship of African consumer interests to structural shifts within Japan's textile industry on the one hand, but also British imperial economic policy. So again, this is kind of a snapshot of a larger project that in many ways is an extension of domesticating the world, but which considers the global reverberations of African consumer interests in a very different kind of global political and economic context. So I do a couple things in the paper that I'm giving today. One is bringing a much older historiography of what was termed trade competition, especially between Britain and Japan. But what I'd like to do is bring this into a conversation with discussions of consumer culture more precisely, as well as some of the contours of early colonial capitalism, and then look at all that in the context of Indian Ocean connectivities. A context that actually bears a lot of similarity, of course, to the work that I did in domesticating the world, but also brings in Japan and Japan's very strong Indian Ocean linkages as they developed in the first half of the 20th century. The other thing I want to do, which has become, unfortunately, quite unfortunately, much more relevant, is I want to bring into focus British uses of tariffs as an economic weapon. The British colonial and foreign policy began to depend quite heavily on tariffs as a means of addressing what they saw as Japanese competition. And I think, again, quite unfortunately, this resonates with our current moment, perhaps in more ways than I could have ever imagined. But first, a little bit of background. Sorry, there. In early 20th century Eastern Africa, most clothing, as everyone here knows, was made of imported cotton textiles. These were unbleached or printed cotton cloth, but cotton cloth that was tailored locally. Much like in the 19th century, cotton textiles remained the most important items of import in terms of value, by far, actually. But one of the things that we're beginning to see in the early 20th century is a significant augmentation of imported textiles with ready-made clothing. Simultaneously, regional migration and the formation of new urban identities, especially in places like Dar es Salaam, Kampala, Nairobi, this encourages the circulation of many new styles, many new fashion trends, as both Muslim and Christian urbanites developed modes of dress that asserted, well, many different social values, but sophistication, for instance, and a kind of worldliness that we see manifesting in very different ways, but in contexts across the region. Now, as everyone here knows, artisans had long tailored sturdy, unbleached American cloth. Sorry, I'll come back to that photo in a second. Both American and Indian textiles, actually, which were referred to as matakani in Swahili, into things like men's kanzu, a long white shirt, often with a very elaborate collar stitched in colorful thread, which was popular in coastal societies going back at least the beginning of the 19th century. But this style and the increasingly complex printed kanga, the two-piece print with multiple colorways, began to find a much wider audience across the region, well beyond the coast and the caravan trails of the 19th century. I'm going to just flip through a couple pictures here to give you a sense of what I'm referring to in terms of sort of shifting styles. But this kind of intersection, you might say, of styles from the Mediterranean, from elsewhere in the Indian Ocean, and of course, increasingly from the West, were evident in urban centers right across the region. This is a photo from early 20th century Zanzibar. Here, a little bit later, Zanzibar town, 1936, but one can see the popularity of kanzu, obviously, as several men in the photo are wearing, but also Western style clothing. So I think this kind of self-conscious identification as worldly and modern, this is a term that in the larger paper I try to unpack to a significant degree in the way that it's used and conceived in East Africa. But in any case, this is manifest in a demand for Western style clothing, albeit clothing that is generally tailored in East Africa to conform to particular fashion trends in the region. Dresses, jackets, trousers, elaborations on Western styles, but which are largely still tailored from Matakani cloth, be it from South Asia or from the United States. And I think one of the things that's important to recognize is that demands for kanzu, for Western style suits and dresses, for kanga, as we see in this image from Mombasa in the early 20th century. The demand was actually increasing exponentially in the early 20th century. And this was not just in the urban centers, this was right across the East African region. So what we see is a kind of explosion of demand for the textiles themselves, yes, but also tailored clothing and increasing, as I said, ready-made clothing by the time we get to the 1920s. This is a Zanzibar tailoring shop in the 1920s. You can see both, well, obviously you can see someone working on a piece of clothing, but you can see kanga along the back wall, quite a lot of kanga, also kanzu and kitenge, as well as the sort of ubiquitous sewing machines, which is a point I'll return to a little bit later. Just to give you a kind of snapshot of what demand meant in terms of household budgets, a late 1930s survey in Western Kenya, for instance, found that about 60% of the average consumer's budget was spent on clothing specifically. Here's a photo from Uganda. Again, the kanzu became quite popular in this era. Another photo from Western Uganda. Dresses, Western style dresses, for instance, ones that are tailored locally, become widely worn right throughout the region. So the point I'm getting to here is that this growing demand for Swahili, Arab, and European styles, combined with increasing purchasing power in the early 20th century, leads to this surge in demand, but a demand specifically for low-cost cotton good imports, which again has a lot of similarities with what we're seeing in the 19th century. But to get to kind of the crux of the historical narrative I want to offer today is that by the early 1920s, there was a major new player in this relationship of the import trade, East Africa's relationship, that is to say, with global cotton goods producers. And that was Japan, because by the early 1920s, Japanese goods were meeting this demand across the Indian Ocean, Africa, in really unprecedented ways for Japanese goods in Eastern Africa. Again, here's a photo from Western Kenya in 1936. I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself, but you can see, both the popularity of older kanzu, for instance, which had come into popularity by the end of the 19th century, as well as more recent Western styles as well for men. The suit, the tie, the shirt, button-up shirt, and so forth. So let me talk a little bit about this relationship between Japan and Eastern Africa as it develops in the early 20th century to give you a little bit of background into the really dramatic growth of the 20s and 30s of the interwar period. Well, Japanese cotton goods were initially re-exported from Bombay and from Aden to East Africa. They weren't initially directly imported. And in fact, this re-export of Japanese goods from India and from Aden seems to continue at least through the interwar period. But one of the shifts that happens between this map and this Japanese map of Africa in 1856 and the early 20th century is direct shipping to African ports. This is an elaborated route map of Osaka Shonsen Kaisha, which was a major shipping line that was delivering cotton goods, amongst other things, to Eastern and Southern Africa, well, the entirety of the continent, but as you can see here, Zanzibar, Dar es Salaam, and right on down the Southern African coast to Cape Town. But this was direct steamship delivery of cotton goods. And so by 1930 already, we're talking about this direct relationship between Osaka, Kobe, and Eastern Africa. And this direct relationship between consumers and Japanese industry really accelerates this relationship by the 1920s. So what we see happening, to give you sort of the wider snapshot, is that European analogs for the Japanese imports, which are in some cases dyed cloth, kanga in particular, Japanese manufacturers put a lot of emphasis on printed cloth, as well as, maybe more importantly, the Americani. European analogs begin to take a back seat. The numbers begin to decline in relation to Japanese goods throughout the 1920s. And the other thing that's happening is that the great majority of finished apparel, everything from shirts to undergarments, hats, shoes, you name it, in Uganda, Kenya, Tanganyika, by the 1920s is made in Japan. So Japanese manufacturers are capitalizing on this kind of diversity of demand that's developing in Eastern Africa, producing Western styles for African markets. But again, far more important is this question of cotton textiles. In fact, most Japanese imports were, in effect, what we can think of as intermediary goods. That is to say, they're goods that are significantly tailored and finished in Eastern Africa. And so I think this complementarity of artisanal and industrial production is really at the heart of Japan's exchanges with Eastern Africa. Now, of course, there are exceptions to that, but really the bulk of what Japanese importers are importing is Americani and dyed textiles. These are just ads for Osaka Shonsen Kaisha, OSK. You can see this is a calendar on the right. But this is one of the ships used in this line. So let me take you into some of the details of what's happening by the time we get to the early 1920s. Japanese goods had actually been significantly consumed in places like Egypt and South Africa before this time period, as early as the late 19th century. But it's really from the early 1920s that we see the significant impact in East Africa and the demand amongst East African consumers increasing substantially. A snapshot of that is by 1924, Japanese goods secured 70% of the Kenyan and Ugandan unbleached textile market, the biggest sector of the import textile market. The same was true in Tanganyika, where at least, by my count, at least 6 varieties of Japanese Matakani were already circulating in East Africa. So different grades of Matakani. And of course, this was alongside many different grades of especially Indian-produced Matakani. By 1934, so jumping ahead a decade, Japan's share of all imported cotton goods, right across the board, rose to 74%. If we look at places like Belgian Congo, it's the same story. Ethiopia is an even more extreme story, where Japanese goods represent a higher percentage. In British Somaliland, by the early 1930s, over 90% of the protectorate's most popular unbleached cloth was made in Japan. And by the by the end of the 1930s, Japanese goods dominated almost every category of Zanzibar's imported textile market. But the other thing that's very interesting is that Zanzibari firms were also re-exporting these cloths. So I'll talk a little bit about the restrictions, tariffs, and so forth later. But one of the things that we see happening in Zanzibar is really significant re-export to Portuguese Mozambique, to Madagascar, to Italian Somalia, to Mauritius, and even, perhaps most surprisingly, in this kind of reversal of historical trends, re-export to India. So Zanzibar and Mombasa as well actually become really significant hubs for the kind of distribution of Japanese goods right through the region. So this popularity of Japanese cotton goods was a consequence of multiple factors, but I want to just outline 3. One is the relative quality of goods. I mean, if you read the British colonial literature, it focuses very narrowly on this idea that Japanese goods were quote unquote inferior, that they weren't quality goods like the British goods that were being imported. Well, it's not really true, because there was a wide range of Japanese goods being produced by a lot of different manufacturers, from very, very large industrial manufacturers to very, very small, 20 loom manufacturers. So there was a wide range. There was a wide range of quality as well. But the thing about Japanese goods is that, a bit like Matakani from New England in the 19th century, the quality was generally pretty good, and the price was low. So those combinations, as everyone here knows, those combinations were really, really attractive to consumers of lesser means to purchase clothing, especially if you're spending 60% of your budget on clothing. That sort of combination of quality and low cost was particularly attractive. But this is the third point. Perhaps most importantly, Japanese manufacturers were highly attentive to local markets. And this isn't unique to East Africa. We see the same thing happening in the Dutch East Indies. We see the same thing with Japanese exports to India, for instance, which is kind of a whole other story. But this attentiveness to local markets, sensitivity to changing taste, agility in production, coordination between consumers, or at least consigners, let's say. People are putting in orders for Mombasa and Zanzibar. The wholesalers, this kind of connection was something that Japanese manufacturers placed a lot of emphasis on, not surprisingly, in an attempt to break into these markets. One of the factors here is that the small size of some textile factories ensured a kind of maximum flexibility. So they could respond quickly, they could retool and produce new types of kanga, for instance. As you all know, Conga is something that that the format has been the same over a very long period of time, but the colorways, the designs, the jina, that is to say the aphorism or the phrase that appears on in Swahili, these change extremely rapidly. Like, you know, over many over seasons, festivals, holidays, these are things that are very much of the moment. And Japanese manufacturers were very attentive to that. So this is actually the earliest example of a Japanese Conga that I've been able to identify. This is from Kyoto Institute of Technology. It was manufactured sometime in the 1930s. Sorry, this bar on my screen is blocking it, but manufactured for Nishihachi in the 1930s. And of course, it's uncut. We're kind of looking at the middle of it. So this was a sample that you can see has multiple colorways. It's got pineapple. It's got all of these sort of classic elements of Conga. I think there's another element here that is important to recognize, that the Japanese government in this period, in an attempt to stimulate the textile as well as other industries, worked with manufacturers to conduct extensive research. This is something that many of their competitors were not doing. For instance, the Ministry of Commerce and Industry sent research teams in the late 1920s to East Africa, and they published 3 really exhaustive reports that were available to textile producers across Japan. And in studying each niche market and developing relationships ultimately with retailers in East Africa, in urban centers specifically, Japanese textile weavers, printers, and trading firms were all able to kind of coordinate and work quickly to supersede most competitors, both European and Indian competitors. So by the time we get to the early 1930s, it's really Kenya that becomes the nucleus of Japan's commercial enterprise across East Africa. In fact, the Japanese government stationed an agent of the Ministry of Commerce and Industry in Nairobi, and then established sample rooms in Nairobi where consigners, wholesalers, retailers could come in and look at various samples of Japanese cloth. This is an example of in early 1930s, a factory in Hyogo Prefecture. Again, pretty small. Here's a finishing factory at the end of the 1920s, producing a very narrow cloth, but also, what we're seeing in the case of Japan is a kind of combination of the very, very large textile mills, as well as a very wide variety of artisanal textile factories. So Nairobi and Mombasa both become kind of centers of this trade. And by the 1930s, these investments on the part of the Japanese government, for instance, begin to pay a lot of dividends. Japan, by 1937, was the most important supplier of nearly all consumer goods to Kenya, which is kind of takes us a little bit further than what I want to talk about today. But by the 1930s, we're not just talking about cotton goods. We're also talking about shoes, glassware, cement, thinking back to the earlier image, bicycles. Japanese bicycles begin to supersede all other, for instance, British exports to Kenya. And even things like beer, which was imported in Kenya from Japan to a very large degree. The volume of beer alone that was imported via Mombasa into colonial Kenya was pretty substantial. In fact, consumer goods imported from Japan to Kenya were nearly double that of British consumer goods by the end of the 1930s. So this takes us to another part of the story, and that's the loss of significant market share on the part of British manufacturers, or at least a perception. In some cases, it was more perception than reality, but the loss of market share to Japanese goods across the region ultimately caused great consternation in British manufacturing and ultimately political circles. Now, France and Portugal had actually introduced really draconian tariffs and quotas quite early on in this period of Japanese exports to Eastern Africa. Merchants in the region found kind of circuitous ways of delivering Japanese goods. But in many ways, Japanese markets, at least in a direct sense, were closed. Italian, French, Portuguese colonial markets were in many ways closed to Japanese direct trade in the 20s and 30s. And so this is also why Kenya kind of becomes a center of redistribution. But if we look at the UK specifically, representatives from Lancashire demanded these kinds of restrictions that France, Portugal, Italy had put in place, and they demanded them globally, specifically restricting Japanese goods. And the backstory here is Lancashire had already lost very important global markets to manufacturers in India and China. So when Japan emerges in this moment as an even more formidable competitor, the preservation of whatever remaining colonial markets it perceived became a high priority for the textile industry. And they placed ultimately a lot of pressure on the British government, on Whitehall in particular. There's a lot of correspondence about this in the National Archives at Kew. So this political pressure shaped British colonial economic policy. And it shaped it from, so I'll just stick with this map for 1 second. And it shaped this policy from Somaliland all the way through to Tanganyika and Nyasaland. And so Japanese commercial agents find themselves in an increasingly difficult position. They likewise faced extreme racial discrimination in Kenya, and most notably in South Africa. South Africa actually classified Japanese citizens, all Japanese citizens, as quote unquote prohibited immigrants. So they in fact tried to limit Japanese trade also by essentially banning all Japanese agents, commercial agents, and anyone else from entering the country. And they instituted extremely high tariffs on Japanese imports. So that was an extreme example. In the case of Britain, free trade treaties with their erstwhile ally Japan from the early 1930s made this a kind of delicate, at least a highly debated subject in British policy circles. But increasingly, what we see by the early 1930s is a reliance on unilateral and increasingly really aggressive means to limit Japanese imports. High tariffs, but also import quotas. So essentially, the British imperial modus operandi was a fear, based on a fear of entrance of Japanese goods into new markets. So the first thing they did is they removed West African colonies from free trade agreements with Japan, and then slowly began to do the same thing in Eastern Africa. So by the time we get to the 1930s, East Africa is a very interesting example of a market where Japanese goods really aren't excluded yet, as compared to many other markets around the world, including British West Africa and West Africa more generally. Now, the effects of these tariffs and regulation, import restrictions, were predictably incredibly uneven. For instance, in British Somaliland, quotas had adverse effects on the economy broadly. In fact, the interesting thing is when you look at the correspondence between like Somaliland and colonial officers are saying this is an incredibly bad idea because this is such a critical part of the economy, and the knock-on effects of these kinds of tariffs can have predictably, again, very adverse consequences. But in response, merchants simply crossed the border to buy Japanese textiles in Ethiopia, where they predominated, and then brought them back into Somaliland. Additionally, instead of buying Japanese cloth and tailoring it in Somaliland, merchants simply bought garments sewn already of Japanese cloth in Yemen. So restrictions never really benefited British industry, certainly didn't herald the return of, British textile industry. And the greatest remaining impediment to restricting Japanese trade was the interwar Congo Basin Treaty, which Britain, in an overtly hostile move, denounced in the mid-1930s and raised tariffs yet further. This had a lot of political consequences, which I won't go into here, but I think it's important to recognize that it severely restrained British-Japanese relations at a time when these relations were already strained and becoming more strained, I should say. So I think it's safe to say it really exacerbated this sort of strained relationship between Britain and Japan, the erstwhile allies of the First World War. But it ultimately did very little to affect East African demand for Japanese cotton goods. I think that's the critical part of the story that that's important to recognize. So for Japanese policymakers, these efforts to block Japanese exports globally struck at the heart of Japan's industrial expansion. But across Eastern Africa, across Indian Ocean Africa, even in the face of these very steep tariffs, which reached as high as 50%, Eastern Africans continued to purchase far, far more Japanese goods than British goods, or in fact, far more than Indian goods as well. So Japanese production at the end of the day remained more attuned to African consumer interests, and prices still were more affordable. And so it was really only the war that stemmed the flow of Japanese goods. As late as early 1941, Japanese goods still dominated the market in Zanzibar, for instance. But there's an important coda here that I want to offer before I begin to wrap up. And that's what happens after the war, because the project that I'm working on now sort of begins in the 20s and extends into about the 70s to about 1980. So I want to give you a snapshot of what happens immediately after the war. Well, from about 1949, Japanese goods again start to be exported to East Africa. And by the 1950s, actually, Japanese trade with the entire continent reached a much higher volume than it had in the interwar period. In fact, by the 1950s, Africa was absorbing nearly 20% of Japan's total exports globally. So African markets were really, really critical for Japan's post-war recovery. And of course, Indian Ocean Africa would be critical to this trade. Here's a conga with the Swahili aphorism, Swahili and Arabic script at the bottom. This was made in Japan. We don't know exactly when, but sometime in the 1950s. Oh, I'll just show you. This is a detail of the sticker that amazingly remained on the the cloth. This was traded through Kenya in Mombasa. Shonan Kogyo, which was an exporter in Wakayama. But Indian Ocean Africa remained critical to this trade. But of course, the trade became much more variegated in the post-war period. At the same time, African markets were absolutely critical for Japanese textile manufacturing firms. For instance, and we have a lot more detail in the post-war period for kind of the way in which these cloths were circulated. This is a photo from Dar es Salaam in the 1950s. You can see a great variety of conga for sale. But a manufacturing firm in Kyoto, Daido Senko, which ultimately would be company Daido Marta, produced conga and kitenge, as you can see here, conga being printed, conga and kitenge, another kind of printed cloth. They produced really an incredible volume for African markets, and they made absolutely nothing for the Japanese market. It produced about 3 million meters of cloth each month solely for African markets, and 20% of that alone was Congo. Obviously, going directly to East Africa. So to sum up, the multidimensional transregional entanglements that I've very briefly sketched out here highlight the exercise, on the one hand, of power by business interests in the UK, for instance, and Japan, the exercise of power by governments. Clearly, the British in colonial East Africa were using extreme measures to try to control the choices of consumers, or at least limit the choices of consumers for a variety of political ends, political and economic ends. But I think what's important to note is that these entanglements were also contingent on local social logics in East Africa. Myriad interests that were distinct from colonial economic policy, and as we've seen, often beyond the effective control of imperial strategists. I think that's one of the most surprising elements of this period is that these attempts to restrict Japanese cloth have very minimal effect. In fact, shifting sartorial cultures and an expanding wage sector in Eastern Africa fueled phenomenal demand for Japanese cotton goods, both before the war, as I've spoken about today, and after the war, which accelerated industrial expansion in Japan and ultimately its post-war recovery as well. Much of Japan's post-war recovery depends on light industry, not heavy industry, and therefore the textile industry becomes one of the cornerstones of Japan's industrial recovery after the Second World War. So measures to restrict Japanese goods in colonial markets, I think it's fair to say, had many reverberations as well. It wasn't just the so-called trade war that had reverberations, but also the deepening political tensions between Britain and Japan in particular. And I think it's safe to say the greater animosity that we see towards the colonial governments across the region in East Africa. Because, of course, everyone understood that the price of these basic consumer goods that consume such a significant part of people's budget was being artificially raised simply for reasons that had political, economic rationales that had nothing to do with East Africans. So the consumer demands of East Africans and measures to restrict Japanese trade thus, I think, affected both transregional economic relationships and colonial governance. Additionally, it's worth repeating that tailoring in Indian Ocean Africa as a form of value adding was the critical link that articulated the economic and cultural spheres of consumers and manufacturers. This is something that, again, we can see in earlier historical moments, but it's particularly clear in the early 20th century that this value adding, which responded directly to the sartorial cultures and the shifts in sartorial cultures in Eastern Africa, offers what I think is still a kind of underappreciated lens through which to view processes of global integration. I should say this is another kanga traded by Shonen Kogyo, printed in the factory that I showed you a moment ago, which later became known as Daido Marta in Kyoto. This is a little bit later in the 60s or early 70s, marketed in Tanzania. And really, the 70s is kind of the end of Japanese preeminence in textile markets. Obviously, there's a transition in the Japanese economy to production of not just heavy industry, not just cars and things like that, but also electronics. And so there's a kind of broader shift in Japanese industry. But interestingly, the kanga and the specialized production that's necessary for the conga is one of the last sort of remaining cornerstones of Japanese textile popularity in Eastern Africa. And so this is, like I said, probably the late 60s or early 70s, obviously post-colonial. So I would just want to end by making the simple point that in centering African consumer and economic interests, I think we can better appreciate the relationship of African cultural imperatives to trans-regional economies, and I think we can see in this example, interstate power as well. In interwar Eastern Africa, collective, everyday consumer choices engendered quite profound inter-imperial entanglements. And that included unusually strong economic links between colonial Indian Ocean Africa and Japan, right up to the eve of the Second World War. So I will stop there.
Thank you, Jeremy. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Great presentation. And I think that now we can start with the question from the floor, and we can collect a couple of questions and then rounds of 2 questions. I mean, if you can be concise and precise, this we can favor a lot, help us a lot in our discussion of your presentation. So, do we have questions from the floor?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
Jeremy, can you say anything about the Japanese side, the production side? Like, first of all, of course, no cotton being produced, I don't think, in Japan. But more generally, what was how many workers were involved? I'm kind of interested in that side of things too, because from a global history perspective, looking at the African side of things is amazingly only one side of the whole equation. And so if you could just say something about, I'm sure there's a literature on this, but if you could just sort of give us a thumbnail sketch of that, I would appreciate it. Thank you.
Now there is also Giacomo. Please, Giacomo, go ahead.
Thank you. Thanks. No, wonderful presentation. Thanks a lot. No, mine is well. I mean, it's in keeping with Professor Alper's question, really. But okay, my first is a curiosity. Where else was Japanese exporting its cloth in the first few decades of the 20th century? This is just for me to form an idea of how truly important was the East African markets. I wonder whether, but I mean, this is just a function of my complete ignorance. Where else were the Japanese exporting the products of their cloth industry? And so again, and following up, I would say, would it be fair to argue that in the absence of East African demand, the trajectory and shape of Japanese industrialization in the early part of the 20th century would have been different? Thanks a lot.
Okay, so Jeremy, the floor is yours.
Absolutely, thank you. Ned and Giacomo, thanks very much. These are fantastic questions. They do dovetail really well. So I'll begin with Ned's question and say that in some cases, these are very large factories. And you're right, there is this really substantial literature that I certainly wouldn't claim to be completely conversant in. But there are some of these very large Japanese firms that are producing especially things like what are being called matakani, but basically unbleached textiles that have hundreds of workers, and they are producing extreme volume. And of course, some of that is going to East Africa, and some of it is going elsewhere. But one of the critiques that you see from the British, and for some degrees the American perspective too, is that all of this is sort of unfair, right? That that wages are unusually low in Japan, that Japan is subsidizing all kinds of things like the steamship lines, which actually that was true. That there's this sort of coordination between government and industry that's giving them unfair advantages. They've devalued the yen. These sort of things are shot through all of the British, and as I said, some degree the American policy conversation. And yet a lot of these factories that things like Conga are produced in, even Daido Marta wasn't a huge factory. It was producing a lot, but it had very specialized production. Some of these ones, like I think the first image I showed, were actually very small. Maybe they only had 20 or 30 employees, and they were producing very niche products for local markets. Part of just to give you a little bit of insight into the Japanese side, part of the production, was really exploitative. I mean, young women in particular were the backbone of the textile industry, and these were often very young women from rural communities who were paid very low wages, and that was true especially in the big factories. So I think the short answer, though, is that there's a lot of different scales that are happening from Kyoto all the way through to the sort of big factories in Osaka, and then small, more artisanal factories throughout the region. Now, the interesting thing is cotton. You mentioned cotton. Japan does grow cotton, but there's a huge caveat here, and that's that Japanese cotton is not exported. Japanese cotton is used for very specific, at least it is now, and to some degree historically, was used for specific types of Japanese clothing. So this was not part of the export industry, which kind of takes us to another question that I didn't address at all, but is very, very important actually for the larger scenario. And this kind of takes us to Giacomo's question, is that all this cotton was imported. And so East Africa becomes really important for Japanese producers as well as consumers. So, of course, most of it is coming from India. And this is another element of the complex relationship between India and Japan, because India is a major consumer of Japanese textiles, major consumer throughout this period. And there's boycotts in Japan. I have a quote from Gandhi actually in the sort of working draft where he says, both Britain and Japan are destroying our textile industry. So there's a lot of pushback in places like China, which was another major market for Japanese goods. China and India being these two really large markets for Japanese goods, but even at the height of this sort of pushback from Indian consumers, Japan's still buying them somewhere close to the majority of cotton that's being produced in India and Uganda. So Uganda becomes another interesting part of the story, because some of this, cotton textiles, cotton goods that are being exported to East Africa, they are made of East African cotton. And the British also try to restrict that. One of the things they do is they restrict Japanese ownership of cotton gins in Uganda and East Africa more generally, which means that it's still making its way to Japan, but it's, for the most part, Indian firms that own the gins that are ginning the cotton, and then Japanese firms are exporting it. So, so cotton actually becomes a really, really, important part of this story of Indian Ocean linkages specifically. So, Giacomo, your question, obviously South Asia is a big export market, China is a big export market, but there's a lot of pressure on all these markets. So major boycotts in China, boycotts in Japan, Southeast Asia, as I mentioned, I think Dutch East Indies, that's another major market. They're producing all kinds of things that are popular in Southeast Asia. Batik in particular becomes, major production for Japanese market, or, wax prints as well, and especially after the war. For West Africa, wax prints become important. Korea, obviously, but many of these markets, I should say, begin to feel, Japan begins to feel these restrictions. And this is where East Africa comes in, because it's not the case that Japan, for Japan, that East Africa was the major market. No, I mean, obviously there aren't as many consumers in the region, even though stuff was very popular. But as all these other markets are becoming closed or highly restricted, East Africa actually becomes more and more important. And Tanganyika in particular, as a mandate state, goes from being somewhat peripheral to increasingly important for Japanese export trade. And so this is why there's so much emphasis on appealing to East African markets, that it is really important to be able to identify markets where there still is a lot of potential for Japanese goods, and really kind of hone in on how you can produce for those markets.
Okay, thank you. So we have already 4 people, and so I think that Beatrice, Karin, and Carolina, and then in the second round, Giorgio and the other people that will ask. Yeah, so Beatrice.
Thank you, best compliments. It's really inspiring and beautiful, this huge word. And I just wanted to know, as we know, all kangas have poetries, written words on them, and in some cases, the kanga becomes a way to express something that is not often possible to express in terms also of political freedom, of unsatisfaction on social issues. So I was asking myself how this trade, dealt with this issue. I mean, the local needs in terms of political and social liberties expressed through the kangas and the import-export organization. I mean, if you have an idea, of course.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, if I can jump in, sorry, Carolina, you were first, but my question is very connected to Beatrice's question. And it is about the GINA, because we know that, I mean, the GINA was provided to producers in Great Britain and India, and of course after independence, also in Kenya, Tanzania, by Swahili women themselves. And the GINA, the messages that they gave to producers were then printed on the kangas. And so it's one question is how the Japanese producers obtain this information from Swahili women, because this for sure determined the success of a particular type of kanga. And this is also connected to the last kanga you showed us, the one from the 1960s and 70s, on which there is this GINA that runs the citizen benefits by building the nation, that is, of course, very nationalistic. And all the kangas I have seen from the 1960s and 70s have that kind of messages that are related to feelings, or to religion, to love competition, so messages between women or between women and men. And of course, nowadays, it's different. There are more political messages on the kangas. Also, NGOs promotes this, or well, promotes this production of kangas with more political or social messages, social campaigns, and so on and so forth. So I was wondering if you have an idea of who committed this specific type of kanga and how Japanese producers collected the information from Swahili women.
Shall you use one in your country? I mean, with your new president, do you think you will need some kangas to express yourself in a new way?
Well,
And
Carolina?
yeah,
Carolina.
First of all, thank you so much for the presentation. So I have two questions. One is more of a curiosity. I was interested in knowing a little bit more which interests or contingencies pushed the Japan to start to ship directly to the African continent rather than re-exporting to India, apart from, I don't know, material evolution of transportation. And then the second one is somewhat connected to Giacomo's question, because you showed us a map, a route map from Japan from the 1930s of all the connection throughout the African continent. So I was wondering if those were still direct shipments from Japan, and if you think it's possible to trace like a history of Japan export in a broader sense throughout the whole African continent, like South Africa, West Africa area. I don't know. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
So, yes.
Shall I go ahead?
Yes, go ahead. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, these are fantastic questions. So I'll start with the Kanga Gina question, because, you know, as you both pointed out, Kanga is a very complicated textile, in that, you know, the material itself might not be high quality because it's not really meant to be worn that long, at least sort of formally worn that long, because it is so, you might say, time specific. But there's a lot of moving parts here, right? Because you have not just the colorways, but you know, this, again, as you both pointed to, you know, the message itself, and all of that has to be properly synced. You can't have a message that doesn't work with the imagery, and the imagery is multi-layered and palimpsest, right? Because, you know, be it you know, flowers or cashew, you know, I mean, they all have these deep meanings in Swahili culture, and the culture of the broader region. And so I think that, or cultures of the broader region, and so there is a lot of coordination. Now, for the interwar period, I just don't have much information. Hideaki Suzuki, who also has, you know, been working on these questions for quite some time, has been able to sort of uncover some at Minpaku, the Museum of National Museum of Ethnology in Osaka. He's been able to sort of get some glimpse into this sort of circulation of information at the granular level, and I think that's the important thing to understand, that this is, it's not that the factories themselves, I mean, I remember, you know, we did a kind of group interview of one of the managers of Daido, Marta, who was a manager from the 60s forward, and I think someone asked him specifically, like, did you come up with these designs? And, you know, his answer was, well, you know, there was sometimes playing around with some Japanese motifs, or the importation of certain motifs, just to, you know, see how well they translated. But at the end of the day, the designs, the colors, especially the Gina, all of this was mapped out in East Africa, in, you know, Mombasa, for instance. So you had the consigners who were saying, this is what we want on the Kanga, and basically drawing that up. Now, who contributed to that? That's an interesting question. And my impression from the post-war period is there are women in Mombasa for instance, who are basically saying, this is what it has to say, this is what, and then you have the wholesaler firms giving that to giving all those details together to the import-export firm, who then take it back to Japan and then say, take it to the factory, a producer, and say, produce this. So there wasn't a lot of input, as far as I can tell, on the Japanese side to any of these designs. It was really like, this is what you have to do. And the turnaround was surprisingly fast. And this kind of takes us to this question also of the direct trade routes. I think the direct trade routes open up a lot of possibilities, which is, probably in part why they're subsidized, right? There's this potential to export more. And let's not forget, this is what Sultan Bargash did in the 19th century. He purchases these steamships, and then he puts them into service on this line that connects Madagascar to Zanzibar to India, or to Bombay, and beyond. And the whole idea is, again, to increase this traffic between East Africa and in that case, a major industrial center, the major industrial center in the Indian Ocean, with very reduced rates. And so this is a real shot in the arm to Japanese export to the Indian Ocean region. As you rightly said, these routes are connecting not just Kobe and Mombasa, they're connecting so many places in between. And it's not that this is kind of a carrying trade, but it is the case that a firm that's operating in the Dutch East Indies, in Bombay, and in Mombasa can use the same ship line. And actually, it seemed to me, especially by the time we get to like the 50s, early 60s, that this transmission, I should say, of Kanga design, which is obviously the most sensitive. The other stuff is not very sensitive, time sensitive at all, but it can happen it's happening really fast. And maybe that's one of the advantages that that Japanese producers have, is that oftentimes for European manufacturers, I know, for British manufacturers, they're not producing that many varieties of Kanga. They might have brighter colors. In some cases, the textile itself is of higher quality. They're much more expensive, but they're not as agile and they're not producing as much. So that kind of the moment. One Gina that I saw in a Japanese report of, it's kind of hard. I mean, as you all know, it's kind of hard to get at some of these questions. So you have to take what I'm saying with a grain of salt. But I found this very interesting reference to what some of these Ginas were in the 1930s. And one of them was just mamboleo, the current things of the moment, modern things, things of the time. So some of them were more evergreen, let's say, but Karen, as you said, absolutely, and some of them are absolutely of the moment. And so I think that direct steamship service opened the door to a faster relay. But then, there's all kinds of things that are being exported to different markets at the same time. And could you do a history of Japanese exports to the entire continent? I think absolutely. I think it's. I mean, I came to this project in part out of astonishment, because I had written this book, Domesticating the World, and I had no idea. I really had no idea that Japanese goods were so important in East African markets in the early 20th century. There are several Japanese colleagues who are doing work on many different aspects of this throughout the Indian Ocean. And I think that it both, brings into focus the way in which Japan became more reliant, you might say, on the Indian Ocean as a series of economic partners, but also inserted itself into the Japanese, companies inserted themselves into the Indian Ocean in ways that that were, yes, about this direct trade, but also about connecting at this very granular level with tastemakers, with people who are much more knowledgeable of these regional markets. And in that sense, it's very similar, you might say, to what the Americans were doing in the 19th century in East Africa. They weren't traveling around the region. They didn't, they weren't getting information, directly from sources in mainland East Africa. This was all kind of a translation that was happening through firms in Zanzibar in particular. And I think the same thing is more or less happening. There's a lot of sort of general information that's circulating and strategy about marketing. But actually, when we get into the details of something like conga that's so specific, these are ideas that are, and motifs, concepts that are generated within East Africa. And again, I think almost exclusively by women and designers by consumers, that is to say, as well as designers in East Africa, translated through these firms, which are sending the request, sending the orders to Japan in this case.
Very interesting, yes.
Thank you.
Thank you.
It's a really important question.
So now it's time for Giorgio, Alessandro, and me, if there is a space also for me. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, first of all, for this amazing lecture. I had one question on, I had a question about brands, especially maybe not related that much to the kangas, but to the kind of more certain clothes, like the Abu Jadid in Ethiopia. Because currently, me and Massimo are researching the export of this kind of clothes from the Italian side to Ethiopia. And we're quite interested in the use of specific brands, how some firms actually try to copy each other. And sometimes we wonder how people come up with specific ideas from brands, which sometimes seem a bit weird or seem to be a bit, let's say, orientalizing. I don't know, they just use a lot of lions or giraffes for the African market, or sometimes they use, in the case of Ethiopia, local rulers, so they have the brand Menelik II and so on. And so, well, I was curious, what was your take on the use of brands by Japanese producers and how they choose it, let's say?
Okay. Now is Alessandro.
Yes. Thank you, Jeremy, for your presentation. It's actually a question that connects to, again, the Gina issue. And I'm still impressed by the last kanga that you showed, the one saying with the Gina, the citizen benefits by building the nation. It clearly resonates with Nyerere Ujama. And I was wondering, can you imagine maybe at some point the two aspects coming together? So the power, the state and the trade. And can you imagine maybe the state or TANU commissioning directly to Japanese firms specific kind of jinas on kangas for political reason? Did you find some sources maybe that can prove that? Thank you.
Thank you.
And okay, it's my turn. So I was, I'm part of the team that with Giorgio, we are working on more or less the same problem, but on the Red Sea, Eritrea, Ethiopia, especially Ethiopia, that was the big market in the region. And I have a comment in fact, on the role of Ethiopia. In my opinion, when we talk about Japan, Ethiopia is key. I mean, Ethiopia is an independent country. So there is no this policy of retaliation against the Japanese, and Ethiopia is in love with Japan. No, there is an entire generation of modern educated that they call themselves Japanizer, no, and started relation with Japan. There were constant relation with Japan delegation visiting each other. So I think that Ethiopia is, because it's independent, is a very important country in order to understand a little bit Japanese trade in the region. My question is about, you said there is a couple of references in your presentation about Japanese commercial agents. Now, could you elaborate a little bit more? Because in Ethiopia, the Italians created a system of trade agencies. There were three trade agencies in northern Ethiopia. And the mandate of the trade agency was to, of course, work on trade, favor, encourage trade between Eritrea and Ethiopia. But they were large, quite large. They were doing, of course, also covering also political aspect, doing a lot of intelligence. But apart from that, they were also taking a lot of interest in trade, and they were collecting information and passing the information to Italy in the hope that that information could be used for producing item that were the item that the local consumer asked. No, but when you talk about Japanese commercial agents, now have you more information on them? How they were organized in the region. Yeah. So, and then we will have another round with Mariella. Okay.
Okay. Yeah, I think these are fantastic questions, and there is a lot of overlap here. So I'll maybe try to address them in no particular order, and I apologize if I skip over something. Yeah, well, maybe I'll just begin with the agents question, because it's pretty straightforward to answer by the 1930s. And so Japanese import-export firms had offices in many East African cities, but most notably Mombasa by the 1920s, but also in places like Cape Town. There were even Japanese retail outlets in Cape Town that were, I don't know the relationship between sort of the commercial agents and the retail outlets, and how closely they worked, together, but presumably fairly close. And so you have agents who are sending information in the in a lot of different ways, including along the lines of what we've just spoken about, the very, very detailed information, but market conditions and so forth. Some of this is also coming through the Japanese consulate. I know that the Japanese consulate is also reporting on market conditions in Eastern Africa, especially in Kenya. So there are many lines of information, but the short answer is that these merchant houses that are involved in import-export do have like formal offices in East African cities, especially Mombasa. But also you have agents who, if we move to the later period where there's a little bit more clarity, who are also taking orders from across the wider region for specific types of textiles. As I said, they have cotton buying agents who are located in Uganda in the interwar period, who are exporting gin cotton from Uganda. So there's a lot of coordination actually between the import and export trade, not necessarily the same companies, but in some cases they are the same companies. But this question of the diplomatic relationship, the political relationship, and the articulation of that. It's a little bit more complicated for Eastern Africa. Ethiopia, as you say, is a much clearer example where there is this kind of interest in Japan that permeates various sectors. It's not just Japanese consumer goods; it's also this diplomatic and a diplomatic and political relationship that's quite strong. That's quite different in East Africa. I mean, people understand, this gets us to the question of brands, people understand that things are from Japan. Japani is a very common term that's used in the, to refer to cotton goods in the and other things too, as I said, but primarily Japanese goods, the Conga says made in Japan on it and so forth. But I don't think that there is, at least I don't see in the records, a kind of strong association with particular Japanese manufacturers, let's say, and local markets. I could be completely wrong on that because, again, like the evidence is pretty slim for the interwar period. But people certainly are conscious, much like with Murakami in the 19th century, people are very conscious of where it's coming from. And so these things like the stickers, which of course are still quite common on Conga, the origin, the sort of references to where it was manufactured. I think these are part of consumer culture very much in the 19th century, but the early 20th century, but did people prefer Conga, produced by different factories in Japan? That's a more complicated question, but I can say with great confidence that there is a general preference for Japanese goods, and people are quite conscious that goods are made in Japan, even if even if the quality might not be as high. There still is a strong preference for Japanese goods because they're kind of meeting that that sort of happy medium, I should say, of quality as well as price. But you raise an interesting question about like ready-made clothing, like apparel, because there's a lot of that coming not just from Japan, but places like Czechoslovakia. A lot of European markets are exporting things like shoes. And, one thing that I can say, I should back up and say, I really don't know if there is this kind of preference for particular brands. But one thing I can say is that there are a lot of fascinating examples of how certain Japanese consumer goods enter the market and then have a kind of electric effect. So I'll give you one example without belaboring it, and that is plimsolls. So canvas, rubber-soled shoes. Well, Japan was producing a lot of these. Japanese manufacturers are producing a lot of plimsolls, and they started exporting them to South Africa in the 20s, I think, or maybe the early 30s. And these are wildly popular because the South African footwear industry is dominated by South African shoe and boot makers, which, are quite expensive. And so when you introduce these shoes that everyone knows are made in Japan, but they're light, they're inexpensive. Canvas, yes, they wear out quick, but at the same time, they're extremely inexpensive compared to everything else in the market. All of a sudden, the demand for these things go through the roof, and the South African Chamber of Commerce is, and of course, the leather industry is like deeply concerned about this, and so they try to ban these plimsolls. So that might not be brand, but there are certainly things that are introduced from Japan that find wide markets that create a lot of anxiety on the part of, in this case, the South African government and South African industries. Ultimately, as I said, Japanese goods are totally banned, in effect, from South Africa. That changes actually in the 1930s, but this is a result of Japanese willingness to import South African wool, and this changes everything. So a lot of these restrictions are rolled back because Japan agrees, the Japanese government agrees to this relationship where they will import a very substantial quantity of the South African annual wool production, wool market, but production for foreign markets. So I'm sorry I don't have a great answer to that, but we can see sort of dimensions across the region. The Kenya versus, sorry, let me say this, the nationalistic GINA, this question, really interesting. Actually, it takes us to a totally different dimension that I haven't touched on yet, and I won't go into a lot of detail because we could talk about this for a long time. And that is what happens with independence. Well, this is a moment of dramatic reshuffling of relationships between now African nations and Japan. And this is actually just as fascinating because in places like Tanzania and Nigeria, for instance, there is a kind of shift towards technology transfer, which I think is kind of lost in a lot of the economic discussions of the early post-colonial era. But actually what we see is this concerted effort, which again is a coordination of the Japanese government and many of the, I think all of the major Japanese textile industry firms to export machinery and engineers to East Africa, to West Africa, to produce cloth. For instance, in Nigeria, using Nigerian cotton. So this is a really dramatic shift in Japan's relationship that's really much more about diplomacy than it is about sort of the desires of the Japanese textile industry. But there's a denouement to this that's interesting. If you look right across the border at Kenya, there are pretty heated Kenyan parliamentary debates about this. They're like, why are we importing all this Japanese textiles? Like, Japan should be building factories here. There's a lot of pushback in the colonial period that's about kind of renegotiating these relationships, imported goods, which isn't surprising, but it is quite interesting that this does actually have real world implications by the 70s and 80s. Sorry, I'm not sure if I addressed all the questions.
Okay, thank you. And now we have Mariella.
Hello, first of all, thank you for your presentation. I enjoyed it a lot. And my question is more a curiosity actually on Japanese history. So I would like to know about the Second World War period, actually after the Second World War. What were Japanese national and international factors which actually, or condition, which actually made possible the recovery of the cotton industry in a defeated Japan? Because I was thinking, and because for other topics, I'm actually looking at Japan's Second World War history, organizational home front, and so on. So I would like to know a little bit more about these aspects, maybe analyzing also what happens in the 30s, because the cotton industry in the 50s recovered quite quickly, right? Quite rapidly after the war. So I was just wondering about the factors that contributed to this recovery. Thank you.
Yeah, that's a great question. And not being a Japan or Japanese history expert, I don't want to tread too deeply into these questions of post-war recovery because I really don't know that much. But I think that obviously Japanese industry is completely decimated by the war, by the American bombing campaign, by the Japanese economy is completely destroyed. And so it is really remarkable that there is such a substantial recovery of light industry in such a short period of time. But although I can't speak to a lot of the circumstances in Japan, I know that you asked about the interwar period too. I know in the interwar period, there is a concerted effort to coordinate. I think that's one of the things that's really, really palpable in the literature of the era. Of course, for the British, this is a massive red flag that's about the unfair trade between Japan and Britain's colonial empire and the world. But I think this kind of coordination, this willingness of various ministries to be involved in assisting Japanese industry to access new markets, and this kind of coordination at every level is something that's really noticeable. It's really remarkable. I mean, this isn't unique to the story that I'm telling, but I think that we see some of that coordination in the post-war period as well. I think that light industry, obviously was much easier to rebuild in the post-war period. And again, since this had been the bedrock of Japan's relationship with African markets, it's not so surprising that Africa becomes even more important in that moment of post-war recovery. But I think that the 1950s are really interesting because it goes beyond recovery. It goes beyond the kind of levels. In fact, it goes way beyond the levels of trade that we saw in the interwar period. And I mean, some of this is that these restrictions of the interwar period are by and large not there anymore. And so you find a greater diversity of exports as well. But those exports become, are continent-wide. I think that's the other part of it, is that yes, East Africa is still important. Yes, they're producing conga, and in fact, Japanese conga dominate the market. And as I said before, they're kind of the last thing, the last kind of pillar of Japanese textile trade with East Africa. But it's also becoming much more diversified. And then it's a very short timeline, between the early 1950s to the early 1960s, when Japan starts to pivot away from export to exporting industrial machinery, which is a story that I still have a long way to go on, but it is a very interesting pivot that's happening. That's both about politics and economics, but in some ways, with African consumers still at the center, but in some ways, this kind of interplay of politics, economics, and consumer interests is kind of what I'm sort of tracking across this whole period. And so, the other thing is this is just the last thing I'll say, is that you could see in the colonial correspondence, the correspondence from Tanganyika, from Kenya, that there is this, extremely strong demand for especially textile imports by the end of the 1940s, because you've had such a long period where essentially very, very little has been imported, right? All these factories elsewhere are producing for wartime reasons, wartime circumstances. And so the market for Japanese goods is very, very much still there by the end of the 1940s. And so, the British textile industry never really recovers. And so I think the Japanese businesses recognized very soon after the war that these markets are still quite viable for Japanese goods, and the demand is, maybe perhaps greater than ever. So thank you.
Thank you,
Jeremy. Well, no further question, I think. So I think is
thank you.
Yeah, to thank
you,
Jeremy, for the very inspiring seminar presentation. And we have next seminar at the end of the month. Anyway, the recommendation, if you want to receive updates, etc., in the chat, there is our email address, so you can be informed about the activities and receive update about the seminars that we have organized for this project. Okay, so again, thank you very much, Jeremy. Thank you all for your participation, and see you next time.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you very
Ciao.
much.
Thank you.
See you
Ciao.
for the
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.